Hi, in this video I'm going to talk about PHP 8.4's lazy objects RFC. This is a very technical feature that has a lot of moving parts. So in this video I'm going to make a surface level introduction to it using Doctrine ORM as an example. We are going to look into how Doctrine ORM uses lazy objects and how it benefits from it going forward. So what is lazy loading? Lazy loading is essentially deferring the constructor of an object until the first time the object is being used. So it means that the constructor of the object is not being called until you actually start using the object. If you don't use the object, then the constructor will not be called, and in case of Doctrine ORM, the object will not be loaded from the database at all. However, the object is already present in the code, in the object graph, so it can be passed around to the different parts in the system. It can be passed to a template, it can be passed to a method performing logic, and as long as you don't access any of the properties of the lazy object, it will not be loaded into memory, and therefore it saves a lot of resources. Let's dive into this RFC a little. So the RFC has been proposed by Arnaud Leblanc and Nicolas Gricas, and especially Nicolas has been working on the concept of lazy loading and lazy proxies in Symfony as well. So Doctrine had its own implementation for lazy loading proxies since version 2, contributed in 2012, and recently switched to the Symfony implementation using the Symfony var exporter component, which Nicolas wrote. So Nicolas is very knowledgeable about proxy objects and knows a lot of the edge cases, and he's the domain expert that contributed to this RFC. And Arnaud is the engine level expert who's also working for the PHP Foundation on PHP as a language. So this RFC was accepted and added to PHP 8.4, and we are going to look how it works based on the Doctrine ORM example. Let's get a little deeper to some code examples to understand how it's working. So this RFC adds new functions that you can call on the ReflectionClass. So it's a reflection level feature, meta programming. And in case of Doctrine, we are using the newLazyGhost method. And lazy ghosts are objects that are the real object and deferred constructor loading until the first property is accessed. This is done using the initializer callback. So you pass the initializer, and the initializer is responsible for loading the object into its state and calling the constructor. newLazyProxy is a little bit different concept that I'm not going into in this video because it's again very technical RFC. It has its own in-depth things that we need to look at, and maybe the topic of a different video later. So the way you are using it is you have an initializer for your class. You call you instantiate a new reflection class, and then you call reflector newLazyGhost, and then you have an instance of my class that's not initialized yet, and initialization is triggered by a few different things. Let's look at this RFC into the initialization triggers. When is an object triggered, and when will lazy loading be triggered? This section lists a few of the cases. So reading or writing a property, testing if a property is set or unsetting it, calling reflection property get value, set value, or the PHP 8.4 equivalents for property hooks get raw value and set raw value, calling reflection object get properties, get property, cloning the object, and this all causes initialization. What is initialization? The initialization callback is called. So here, what we see here, this callback is called, and afterwards the object is marked as initialized. So let's dive into a code example that I've prepared before to see how this actually works. I have prepared a little project and it has a post entity in Doctrine. And we are using the Doctrine 3.4 development branch because the integration with this lazy loading RFC is not released yet. So the post entity has just an ID and a message and a reference to an author. So it's very straightforward. And we are using a small script as an example here to see how this works. So in Doctrine, the method getReference on the entity manager creates an instance of a proxy. That means this is a lazy reference of the post object. So the way this works is we have the getID method and the getMessage. And now we are trying to see how lazy loading works under the hood. Let's look at this using a profiler so that we can see the runtime behavior of the Proxy RFC and lazy objects feature. And I am a huge fan of trying to understand code not only by reading the code in the IDE, but also running it and in a profiler understanding the trace flow. So let's look at calls to the function, calls to the two methods on the post object. So we had getID and we had getMessage, and the output of the script prints the ID and prints the message here. So how does lazy loading come into play for the proxy? So that's easy to see in this case because getID is called once and is very fast. getMessage, however, takes unreasonably long for a simple getter. And it's easy to see why, because as you can see here, getMessage has a child function, closure proxy factory get proxy, and you can see below it calls the database at the end and also connects to the database. So post getMessage, the rendering of the message, is triggering the lazy loading. And now let's try to find out how that works and why the lazy loading wasn't triggered by calling the getID method. So we use proxy factory get proxy line 173 as an entry point to understand this. And going back to the IDE, we are searching for proxy factory and trying to understand that code. So the getProxy method and line 173 is what we are looking at. So we can see here, entity manager get configuration is native lazy objects enabled is checked. So this is a new functionality and I have called this on the Doctrine config object enable native lazy objects. With Doctrine 3.4 we are going to release the old and the new proxies side by side and you can opt into them. The reason for this is this feature requires 8.4 obviously, not all users of the ORM 3 are using it. But also since it's a completely different implementation, we want users to opt into it and test it on their applications before moving. However, our goal is that we are removing the old way of generating proxies in Doctrine 4 when we increase the requirement to PHP 8.4, and the benefit we will gain from this is that we can get rid of the code generation proxy approach and also all the engine level hacks that we are using to implement proxy generation at the moment. So native lazy objects are enabled. We are looking at the proxy factory. What does it do? It calls ReflectionClass newLazyGhost. That is what we saw in the RFC. It creates an initializer here, and the initializer essentially does only one method call. It calls entity persister load by ID using an identifier and an object. The object is passed to the initializer, and the identifier is bound to this closure as a use variable. So we are keeping the identifier for this proxy inside the initializer, and when the initialization is called, we use this to call the load by ID method on the entity persister. The entity persister is a Doctrine API, low-level API, that loads an object from the database, and when the second object when the second argument is passed as an object, it will use that object as a reference and populate the properties of that. So that is what essentially we need for this feature to work and nothing more. So it's really just using newLazyGhost, this initializer. We already have this load by ID method available. In the Doctrine API, we didn't need to implement anything new, and this essentially worked out of the box without many changes. So this doesn't answer the question why the method called postGetID didn't trigger lazy loading. So to remind you, we have postGetMessage triggering it, postGetID didn't trigger it, and if we look back at the code, postGetID is called first. So it should have triggered it, given that it was printing the value already. So what is this proxy magic at place there? So all magic is there to be understood. That's actually very simple. Doctrine has an API called property accessors. Property accessors API we had to add to support property hooks in Doctrine. And it also enabled us to support proxy objects. And we will see for why this is the case in a few seconds. Let's go down the rabbit hole here. Property accessor set value. So let's go into that. It's an interface, and we have a few implementations. So what we could do now is look at the profiler, which implementation is used. Raw value property accessor set value and type no default property accessor set value. Those two are called. So let's look at both of them. Type no default property accessor is a delegatee, so it calls another property accessor in set value, and this is what's happening in our case. So let's look at the second implementation, raw value property accessor, and the set value method of this one is what we are looking at. We see set raw value without lazy initialization. So what does that mean? Going back to the RFC, we talked about initialization triggers, and the lazy objects RFC comes with a few features to work around lazy loading. That means we can set a property to a value already without triggering initialization. And then if we read from this property, the value is already present and initialization doesn't have to happen. So this is what's happening here. We see here the following special cases do not trigger initialization of a lazy object. Set raw value without lazy initialization. So let's look again in the profiler if this method is being called. Set raw value without lazy initialization is being called. So here the lazy initialization is circumvented. This value is set on the property, on the entity already, and this is why calling postGetID does not trigger lazy loading. Let's go back to the code example to try to understand it again. We load a post object from the database, get reference. No, we don't load it from the database. We create a lazy object for this post entity here with ID 1. Inside the proxy factory, getProxy is called for the post class with the identifier. It's already a known information, the identifier for an instance of an entity. This known information is then used to populate the property, and this is why it doesn't trigger when getID is called. It's getting called when getMessage is called because this is not available yet. Initialization is triggered, the entity is loaded, both getMessage and also the author are being populated at that point. So let's play around with the proxy script a little bit more. Let's add echo for the author ID. And again, run this with the profiler. So here we see post ID, message hello world 1, author ID 1, so this worked. Let's take a look at what's happening here. In the overview we can see again a doctrine load for post, but we don't see a doctrine load for the author. Let's look in the call graph for all calls to the user object. User getID is being called. It doesn't have children, it's child calls. So again here, since the identifier is known while constructing the proxy, set raw value without initialization is used, and reading this value back from the object does not trigger lazy loading. And we can print the ID of the user without loading the object from the database. So let's take it a little one step further. Let's print the name of the author, and this so we see here author ID 1 and then the name of the author. And now if we look at the profile, we see there is a doctrine call to a user to load the user entity. And we see also a query on the user table. And looking again at the user object, getName has a runtime that is quite large for just a getter. And looking at this, we see again here a call to the proxy factory, and we see the proxy factory is called from two different locations. Post getMessage, we already saw that before, and now from user getName. So both of these locations in the code trigger lazy loading and load this information into memory. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you liked my introduction into lazy loading and the lazy loading feature in PHP 8.4. If you want to consume similar content like this, please subscribe to this channel and continue watching and looking out for my content that goes deep into PHP performance. In a next version of this series, I will look into the lazy proxy equivalent of the RFC and explain what you can use that for. And I hope you got a good insight into lazy objects and how Doctrine works, and maybe also got some ideas how you can use this yourself in your own code to improve performance by simulating the availability of objects without loading them at the time of construction, instead deferring the loading of the object and deferring the constructor of the objects to the latest possible point where you need the values that are assigned to the properties there. Thank you very much for listening. I hope to see you back soon.